January 17, 1944, 04:22 a.m., off the coast of Newfoundland. The wind clawed across the frozen deck of U-703 like a living creature, screaming through every loose rivet and seam. General Werner Falk, gray-haired, rigid, the kind of officer whose boots seemed chiseled from the same steel as the hull beneath him, leaned over the conning tower rail as another Arctic gust hurled salt and snow against his face. Below, the diesel throbbed with the strained heartbeat of a hunted animal. He had come aboard this old Type 7C boat to observe morale among the Atlantic crews, but after 6 hours in the North Atlantic winter, the pretense felt almost insulting. The war had turned. Even he could taste it in the air. Sharp, metallic, something like the cold breath before a door slammed shut. The sea was a black plain broken only by white shards of moonlit ice. When the next wave struck the bow, he heard the distorted groan of steel under stress, followed by a sputter in the engine's rhythm. The chief engineer shouted something too fast to catch, and suddenly the deck pitched. Falk braced himself against the icy railing, boots slipping on rime as the submarine took a shuddering roll to port. A thin line of smoke curled from the vent below, dark, oily, wrong. Another cough from the engine room, and the entire vibration of the vessel changed timbre, deepening into a slow, sickly pulse. "Overheating? Starboard compressor?" a sailor yelled, bursting onto the bridge with breath crystallizing instantly in the freezing air. Falk felt the moment stretch painfully long. Compressor failure here so far north meant immobility. Immobility meant death. The Allies didn't need to see them. The cold would do the job for them. He ordered the men below and descended into the suffocating heat of the engine compartment. Diesel fumes wrapped around him like an invisible vice. Sparks streaked across the room where two engineers fought the stubborn bolts of a red-hot casing. The compressor hammered a desperate rhythm, as if begging for mercy. The boat bucked again, harder, and the lights flickered to a sick yellow glow. A pipe hissed. Something hissed back. Falk's gloved hand touched a railing and burned through the leather. He snapped his hand away and barked an order. But even as he spoke, a wrench slipped from a sailor's fingers and clattered to the floor. The entire boat went momentarily quiet, holding its breath. Then the engine died. Silence. A silence so total it felt geological. A silence that swallowed every remaining pretense of control. For a heartbeat, Falk could hear only the muffled breathing of the men around him and the far-off groan of ice pressing against the hull. The submarine was drifting now, carried by a sea that didn't care who won or lost wars. He ordered emergency procedures, but the compressors were gone. They would have to surface fully and hope someone saw them before they froze. As the crew scrambled, Falk returned to the bridge. Dawn was a thin, brittle line far off on the horizon, barely enough light to distinguish sea from sky. Snow blew horizontally, slicing through the dark like shrapnel. "Radio for assistance," he said, but the words tasted wrong even to him. In these waters, assistance could mean capture. Minutes later, the radio man climbed halfway up the ladder and called that the antenna was iced over and the transmitter weak. They needed a clear window or a miracle. Falk chose the miracle. He commanded the boat to surface completely, hoping the rising sun would thaw just enough metal to let a signal crawl across the Atlantic. At 06:03, U-703 broke the surface, coughing up seawater and steam. The wind hit like a fist. Falk stepped out, gripping the frozen ladder, and stared into the blind white void. The ocean looked like a continent of broken glass. Somewhere above, gulls cried with the thin, cruel clarity of scavengers waiting for the living to become the dead. The radio man tried again. Nothing but static. Falk felt the weight of inevitability settle on his shoulders. The engine failure, the frozen antenna, the drifting, a dozen little accidents that added up to a verdict. Then, faintly, through the storm, another sound. A hum, soft at first, like a mosquito in a hurricane. It grew, took shape, separated itself from the wind. An aircraft. Falk squinted into the swirling snow. There, a dark form cutting through the white. Twin engines, heavy frame. Not British gray, not American olive. Canadian roundels, unmistakable against the ghostly morning sky. A patrol plane. The irony hit him with the same force as the wind. The Reich had always dismissed the Canadian forces as auxiliary, peripheral, a footnote of the Empire. And yet here, in the middle of the Atlantic, at the worst possible moment, Canada had found him first. The plane circled once, slow, deliberate, a predator studying weakened prey. Falk expected the dive immediately, the strafing run, the torpedo. Instead, The aircraft dropped altitude, tilting its nose in a gesture almost curious, as if asking a question. "Signal them," Falk said. The radio man hesitated. "But, sir, do it." The plane answered with a single flare, bright reddish-orange, drifting against the blizzard wind like the ember of a dying war. A moment later, the static in the radio cracked, then cleared, and a voice came through. Young, calm, almost disarmingly serene. "U-boat on grid 42C. If you are in distress, acknowledge." Falk froze, not because the voice was English, but because it sounded impossibly young. Barely a man's voice at all. Clear, steady, Canadian. He imagined a boy sitting in a heated radio compartment, pencil behind his ear, uniform too big for his shoulders, unaware of the history swirling beneath his aircraft. "Respond," Falk ordered again. The radio man's trembling fingers turned the dial. "We acknowledge." There was a pause on the other end. Not cold, not accusing, simply present. "Copy, hold position, we're not firing. Repeat, we're not firing. Coast Guard vessel approaching. Maintain course and remain surfaced." Falk let the headset slip from his hand. The words rang in his skull with a weight that made his chest tighten. He had expected contempt. He had expected mockery. He had expected the victorious cruelty of a young Allied airman who could decide life or death with the tilt of his wrist. But there had been none of that. Just composure, and something almost like compassion. Snow clung to Falk's coat as he leaned against the rail. The roar of the engines overhead softened as the plane held its looping pattern. He realized then, not through logic but through something deeper and harder to articulate, that the war in the Atlantic was no longer a contest of submarines and tonnage. It had become a contest of endurance, and the Axis had already fallen behind. That calm Canadian voice, steady as a lighthouse in the storm, was not an opponent breaking them. It was the world moving on without them. And for the first time since the war began, Werner Falk felt small, very small, smaller than a drifting submarine in a frozen sea. The Canadian patrol plane kept its circular vigil above the immobilized U-703, its engines smoothing out into a rhythmic, almost ceremonial hum as the morning light hardened from a pale silver into a harsher winter blue. Werner Falk stood on the conning tower, his coat rigid with ice, and felt the old submarine drift obediently beneath him like a stunned whale. The crew moved with muted urgency, clearing vents and shoveling ice from metal that burned cold enough to blister skin. Yet something in the atmosphere had shifted. The panic had drained away, replaced by a strange, suspended calm. Above them, the aircraft no longer felt like a hunter. It felt like a witness. By 0802, the storm had thinned into a steady snowfall that seemed to erase the edges of the world. The horizon dissolved into a blank white screen, where sea and sky merged in an indifferent embrace. Falk's breath formed clouds that hovered briefly before being devoured by the wind. He kept replaying the voice he had heard over the radio. Young, measured, surprisingly gentle for someone who held so much power at that moment. A Canadian Coast Guard cutter broke through the veil of snow just after 09 wow, its bow pushing aside slabs of drift ice as if parting curtains to enter a stage. It was not a warship. No guns, no threat, no bristling sense of danger. Just a vessel painted in red and white, carrying men bundled in heavy parkas, their faces open and curious rather than hostile. Falk watched them approach with a feeling that unsettled him more than enemy fire ever had. He had prepared for hatred or humiliation. He had not prepared for neutrality. The cutter stopped a careful distance away, and a small launch was lowered. 3 Canadians rowed across the short gap between the vessels, oars creaking under the weight of frost. When they boarded U-703, they did so without rifles raised, without barking orders. The lead officer, a man with wind-burned skin and frost clinging to his beard, simply saluted Falk with a modest gesture that almost startled him. "General Falk?" the Canadian asked, breath steaming. Falk nodded. The man introduced himself as Lieutenant Stephen McLeod, his tone respectful, even cordial. There was no triumph in his voice, no condescension, only the steady professionalism of someone doing a bitter job in brutal conditions. "We're here to assist with evacuation," McLeod said. "Your vessel is dead in the water, sir. Temperatures are dropping. Staying aboard much longer is unsafe." The words carried no accusation, yet each syllable felt like a verdict. Falk inclined his head, signaling assent. His men gathered what little they could carry before filing into the Canadian launch. Falk waited until the last sailor had stepped in before following. He glanced once over his shoulder at the submarine, its hull encased in ice, its emblem half buried under frost, a relic sinking back into the abyss of its own obsolescence. As the launch pulled away, the Canadian plane dipped its wings in a small arc, as if bidding farewell before banking southward. Its departure left an audible emptiness in the sky. Falk sat stiffly in the rocking boat, listening to his crew breathe in the cold, shallow gasps of men who were beginning to understand that the war surrounding them was larger than their training, larger than their pride, and certainly larger than any single nation's ambitions. The Coast Guard cutter's interior felt shockingly warm. The sudden change in temperature made Falk's skin prickle, as though the heat were an accusation of weakness. The Canadians guided them below deck with calm efficiency. Blankets were offered. Hot metal mugs of something warm, coffee or stew, were pressed into numb hands. Falk felt a surge of resistance, an instinctive recoil from accepting comfort from an enemy. But when the steam rose toward his frozen face, it was as impossible to reject as oxygen. It was inside the cutter's radio compartment, however, that Falk experienced the first fracture in his internal defenses. The door was open, and he paused at the threshold. Inside, a boy, he could have been no older than 18, sat at a desk cluttered with signal sheets and coded grids. Thick headphones rested around his neck. His hair was too long for military standards, curling at the nape. His face still held the softness of adolescence, though his eyes carried a focus far older. He looked up when Falk entered, not startled, not fearful, simply present. "Morning, sir," the boy said, offering a small nod. His voice was unmistakable, the same steady tone that had spoken through the storm. Falk stepped inside. The room was cramped, humming faintly with equipment, warm like the inside of a wool coat. The boy straightened a stack of signal papers, his movements precise but unhurried. "You were the one on the radio," Falk said. "Yes, sir. Corporal Daniel O'Leary, radio operator." The boy's expression was polite, almost shy. "Glad we got through before things got worse for you." The simplicity of the statement struck Falk harder than any accusation could have. "You sounded—" He hesitated, searching for the right word. "Calm." O'Leary smiled, a small, fleeting curve of the lips. "You sounded cold. Seemed like someone had to stay calm." Falk had no answer. He felt suddenly aware of his age, of the decades carved into his face, of the metals that now felt heavy and irrelevant beneath his coat. This boy, with ink-stained fingers and a voice still settling into adulthood, had held in his hands the lives of everyone on U-703, not with violence, not with superiority, just with an open frequency and a steady heartbeat. O'Leary continued adjusting dials, then paused. "My father fishes these waters," he said casually, as though discussing the weather. "He says the sea doesn't care whose flag you serve under. Cold drowns everyone the same." Falk absorbed the words slowly. In Berlin, the war was marble and strategy. On the propaganda posters, it was destiny. But here, inside this warm metal shelter drifting on the edge of the world, the war was reduced to its bare truth. An old man and a teenage radio operator, separated by ideology but united by survival. When Falk left the radio room, something in him felt loosened, not broken, but slightly unfastened, as if an internal rivet had finally given way after years of pressure. The Canadians escorted the German crew to a makeshift barracks on the cutter's lower deck. It was stark but clean, rows of cots lined with wool blankets. There was an unmistakable smell of fuel, damp wood, and something faintly citrus, perhaps soap. The German crew settled uneasily, some casting glances at the Canadians standing watch, unsure how to behave in captivity. But the guards did little more than observe. No shouting, no hostility. One even offered a deck of cards to the nearest German, who accepted it with a wary, almost embarrassed nod. Falk sat on a cot near the bulkhead, listening to the muffled hum of the ship's engines. Every vibration felt like a reminder of the U-boat's silence, a contrast so sharp he almost winced. Snow continued to fall outside, tapping gently against the portholes like distant fingertips. Later, when Lieutenant McLeod approached with a clipboard, Falk braced himself for interrogation. Instead, the Canadian simply asked if any of his men were injured or frostbitten. Falk answered stiffly, unwilling to allow gratitude to creep into his voice. But as McLeod turned to leave, Falk found himself speaking. "Your radio operator," he said quietly. "He is very young." McLeod nodded. "Most are these days, yet very composed." A faint smile touched the Canadian's mouth. "Danny? He's steady, listens more than he talks, good at reading the airwaves and people. Helps when you're out here." Falk didn't respond. He didn't need to. The realization settled over him like a slow snowfall. The battle for the Atlantic was no longer about who had the strongest hulls or the most cunning commanders. It had shifted into something quieter, something built by thousands of small actions from ordinary men like O'Leary, men who carried no banners, no ideology, only skill and calm and a stubborn refusal to let the ocean claim another life. By nightfall, the cutter turned south. The U-703 faded into the white horizon behind them, swallowed by the same sea that had lived in every German briefing as an arena of conquest. Now Falk saw it for what it truly was, an indifferent graveyard. He stared through a frosted porthole, watching the dark waves churn under the cutter's lights. His reflection hovered faintly in the glass, older, softer around the eyes, strangely unfamiliar. The war, he realized, was beginning to end not in grand offensives or declarations, but in small, quiet moments, like the one he had lived that morning. A radio signal, a boy's steady voice, a decision not to pull a trigger. Somewhere deep inside, a truth stirred, a truth he was not yet ready to name. The Coast Guard cutter moved steadily southward through the twilight, its engines humming with a confidence Falk hadn't felt under his feet in years. Along the horizon, the last embers of daylight dissolved into a deep indigo band that hovered over the black Atlantic. The sea had calmed, but the cold still pressed against the hull like an unspoken threat. Falk lay awake in his bunk, coat folded neatly at his side, unable to sleep despite the warmth he had been given. The gentle sway of the cutter felt alien compared to the sharp, anxious movements of a U-boat. Here, nothing lurked beneath them. Nothing waited to strike. It was as though he had stepped into another world, one that refused to acknowledge the rules of the war he had spent years memorizing. He rose quietly and made his way through the narrow corridor, boots whispering over the metal floor. The lights were dimmed for night operations, casting the interior in a faint amber glow that made every shadow seem deeper, softer. As he climbed to the upper deck, a gust of frigid air slapped him across the face. The sky had cleared, revealing a canopy of stars so sharp and countless they seemed to pulse with the cold. The moon hung low, a half-lit disk appearing and disappearing behind drifting clouds. On the starboard side, a lone figure leaned against the railing, Corporal O'Leary. His silhouette looked fragile against the vastness surrounding him, the kind of shape the sea could erase without effort. He didn't turn when Falk approached. He seemed lost in the sound of the water sliding along the hull, as though listening to some private frequency only he could hear. Falk stopped a few paces away. "You are awake late." O'Leary nodded without surprise. "Radio checks at night. Signals travel farther in the cold. You can hear things from half the ocean away." He tapped his ear lightly, a gesture both habitual and humble. "Helps to stay up." The wind tugged at the boy's coat, carrying with it the faint scent of kelp and diesel. Falk joined him at the railing, staring out at the black water. For a few minutes, neither spoke. The silence didn't feel strained. It felt inevitable. "When did you enlist?" Falk asked finally, his voice low. "Last spring. I turned 18 in April." O'Leary exhaled into the night, breath turning to mist. "Was supposed to go to college in St. John's, radio engineering, but the war ate all the seats. So I thought, maybe this is close enough." Falk studied him in the moonlight. The boy's profile was soft, but his eyes, even in shadow, carried a kind of clarity he'd seen only in seasoned officers. Not hardness, not bravado, just an understanding of the world that made age feel irrelevant. "You speak with discipline," Falk said. "My father says the ocean teaches you fast. You either listen or you disappear." O'Leary smiled slightly. "Maybe the war isn't so different." The words lingered between them, drifting like the mist above the waves. Falk felt the shift again and that subtle, almost painful sensation that something inside him was changing shape. The war he knew, the war of maps and tonnage quotas, seemed fragile next to this simple truth spoken by a boy who navigated the Atlantic with headphones and intuition. A low bell rang from the bridge, followed by muffled footsteps above them. O'Leary glanced toward the sound. "Night watch changeover," he murmured. "Would you like to see something?" Falk raised an eyebrow but followed as the boy led him toward the radio room. Inside, the equipment glowed faintly, casting warm halos over metal dials and wires. It smelled of warm circuits and paper, strangely comforting, strangely human. O'Leary adjusted a knob, then another, and static blossomed through the room like a coarse, icy wind. "It's quiet tonight," the boy said softly. "Good nights always are, but sometimes if you listen long enough you can hear the edges of other worlds." He tilted the dial. A faint pattern emerged. Long and short pulses. Distant. Uneven. Morse? Falk asked. Drift from somewhere out east. Probably fishing vessels bouncing signals off the storm. Another twist of the dial. The static deepened, then softened into something nearly melodic. Sometimes I hear Russian trawlers. Sometimes Norwegian weather reports. Sometimes, he paused, fingers resting lightly on the metal. Sometimes distress calls. Falk felt a chill run deeper than the cold outside. Do you answer them? If we're closest, O'Leary said. Distance doesn't matter on the radio waves. Doesn't matter who's calling either. You answer. His voice held no pride, no ideology. Just a simple rule shaped by survival and decency. Falk realized then that this boy, sitting in a cramped radio room on a Canadian cutter, had been given a kind of power no general could command, the power to choose connection instead of destruction. As Falk watched, O'Leary leaned back in his chair, listening with a focus that was almost reverent. For a moment, Falk imagined the countless signals floating across the Atlantic, cries for help, coded orders, nervous messages home, final transmissions never replied to, an entire hidden layer of the war, invisible but omnipresent, carried not by guns but by wavelengths. It struck him that the U-boat fleet had underestimated this dimension. They had hunted by periscope and torpedoes, blind to the silent web being woven above them by men like O'Leary, men who understood the ocean as a conductor of voices rather than a battlefield. You're wondering something, the boy said quietly without looking. Falk blinked. Am I? You're wondering how someone my age handles listening to all this. O'Leary finally met his gaze. You're wondering what happens when you hear someone drown on the other end of a signal you can't reach. The depth in the boy's voice cut through Falk with a precision no weapon could match. He had commanded flotillas, issued orders that sent men to their deaths, watched steel burn and explode and vanish into the deep, but he had never considered what it meant to hear someone die, to feel the helplessness of distance, the weight of a voice fading into static. How do you bear it? Falk asked, his words sounding older than he expected. O'Leary shrugged gently. By remembering they're not enemies on the radio, just people who ran out of luck. His fingers hovered over the transmitter. And by answering when I can. A long silence filled the space. The only sound was the quiet hum of the equipment and the faint wash of waves against the hull. Falk felt something settle inside him. Not clarity, not peace, but recognition. Recognition that the war had taken a shape he no longer understood. It wasn't just fought with torpedoes or depth charges. It was fought in unseen channels carried by quiet decisions made by boys with steady hands. A soft knock came at the door. Lieutenant McLeod stepped in, his breath forming a small cloud. We'll reach port by morning, he said. Weather's holding. Falk nodded. The lieutenant gave O'Leary a brief look, something between respect and familiarity, before leaving. The radio operator returned his attention to the console, adjusting a switch with the tenderness of someone handling something alive. Falk remained a moment longer, absorbing the scene. The dim light on O'Leary's face, the steady tapping of the keys, the rhythmic breathing of the Atlantic against the hull. Nothing grand, nothing heroic. And yet it felt like the most important truth he'd witnessed in years. Before leaving, he spoke quietly. Corporal O'Leary. The boy looked up. Your father was right, Falk said. The ocean teaches fast. O'Leary's smile was small but genuine, and it always tells the truth. As Falk stepped back into the corridor, he felt the warmth of the radio room fall away, replaced by the cold certainty of the steel around him. The cutter continued slicing through the dark water, each churn of its propellers carrying him farther from the world he had known, and deeper into the one he would soon be forced to understand. Dawn came softly, not with color but with a slow lifting of darkness, as though the world were waking reluctantly. The Canadian cutter approached the harbor, through a corridor of fog that clung to the water like smoke from an invisible fire. Wooden docks emerged one by one, pale shapes dissolving and reforming in the shifting mist. The crew moved quietly, their breath drifting upward in thin silver trails. No triumphant shouts, no accusatory glares, just the steady routine of men accustomed to harsh mornings and harder seas. Werner Falk stood on deck, hands clasped behind his back, coat buttoned to the throat. He watched the coastline materialize. Low warehouses coated in frost, fishing boats tied in neat rows, the distant silhouettes of cranes frozen in place like skeletal guardians. It was not a battlefield, not even a military port, just a cold, work-worn edge of the world where life persisted despite everything. He felt a heaviness settle in his chest. Not humiliation, not dread, but something quieter and far more complicated. The sea around them glimmered faintly as the sun pushed through the fog, each ripple catching light like a thin blade. The ship slowed. Lines were tossed. Metal rang against wood. As the Germans disembarked, the Canadians formed a loose corridor along the dock, but they didn't stand stiffly or hold their rifles in rigid poses. Some nodded. Some offered brief, almost sympathetic glances. These were not men celebrating the capture of an enemy. They were men who understood the ocean had already won that fight, long before anyone stepped onto land. Falk descended last. The wooden boards creaked under his boots. The cold bit at his face, sharper now that the storm had passed and the world had settled into its frigid clarity. He breathed in the scent of brine, diesel, and something faintly sweet, wood smoke drifting from chimneys farther inland. Lieutenant McLeod approached, clipboard tucked under his arm. "There will be transport shortly," he said. "Warm quarters until further transfer. Medical checks for anyone who needs it." Falk nodded stiffly. He could not bring himself to thank the man, though the words pressed at his throat like an insistent tide, not out of pride, that had begun to crumble hours ago, but because gratitude felt like too fragile a bridge to cross in that moment. He noticed movement near the bow. Corporal O'Leary had stepped off the ship and now stood on the dock, adjusting his cap against the cold. He looked impossibly young in the full morning light, cheeks flushed pink from the frigid air. When he saw Falk watching, he hesitated, then gave a small, almost reluctant smile, the kind one offers when parting from someone unexpectedly familiar. Falk walked toward him. The boy straightened instinctively, though not out of fear, simply respect. The way one might react to a school teacher or a village elder, not an enemy general. "You will continue on patrol?" Falk asked. "Yes, sir, weather permitting." O'Leary glanced toward the gray horizon. "Signals are clearer these days. Too clear sometimes." Falk understood the meaning behind those words. Clear signals meant losses, distance, silence where voices once called. The boy carried more ghosts than his age should allow. "You did your duty," Falk said. "You did it well." O'Leary didn't look away, but his expression softened. "So did your men, sir. Nobody deserved to freeze out there." A pause. "Whatever uniforms they wear." That sentence landed with the weight of an anchor. Not sharp, not heavy-handed, just true. As unembellished as the cold air between them. Falk realized with a sudden jolt of clarity that this boy had not won anything in the traditional sense. No medals, no strategic victory, no heroic tale to carry home. And yet somehow, he had undone years of indoctrination in a single morning. Not with arguments, not with superiority, but with decency. The kind that survives wars. The kind that ends them. Footsteps echoed on the dock as Canadian personnel began guiding the prisoners toward a warehouse converted into temporary quarters. Falk lingered a moment longer, watching O'Leary walk toward the cutter, hands in his coat pockets, shoulders hunched slightly against the wind, a small figure swallowed by fog. Something tugged inside Falk. Subtle, almost painful. He could not name it, not fully, but it lived somewhere between respect and regret, between recognition and revelation. The warehouse was warm inside, lit by hanging lamps that cast pale circles across the wooden floor. Falk was given a cot near a window crusted with frost. His men spoke in low voices, some rubbing their hands near a stove, others staring blankly at the ceiling. They looked exhausted, not defeated, just worn down to the essential core of human endurance. When Falk sat on the cot, the lamp above flickered. Outside, a gull cried once, a thin echo through the icy air. He imagined O'Leary back in the radio room of the cutter, headphones on, listening to the ocean's endless conversation, hearing signals rise and fall, hearing the world shift, one frequency at a time. Falk leaned forward, elbows on his knees. His breath formed a soft cloud in the cold pocket near the window. He closed his eyes. The war would continue elsewhere. Admirals would issue orders. Politicians would draw lines. Submarines would dive and vanish again into the deep. But nothing, no strategy, no triumph, no doctrine, would erase the sound of that young Canadian voice cutting through the storm with calm certainty. A voice that had not mocked, not threatened, not conquered, just answered. Hours later, as the fog lifted and the harbor settled into a brittle quiet, Falk opened his eyes and saw a thin ray of sunlight dancing across the floorboards. He watched it for a long time. It did not warm the room, but somehow it warmed him,